I asked my twin sister to cover my shift for 1 day. Let me be clear about what this means before I tell you what happened, because the what this means is important context for the what happened. My twin sister, Diane, is not in the military. She has never been in the military. She has no interest in the military and has expressed this interest, or rather this absence of interest, consistently and without ambiguity since we were 17 years old and I first told her I was considering enlisting. She said, in the specific, direct way Diane says everything, "That's your thing, not mine." And then she became a high school English teacher, which is perhaps the civilian occupation most diametrically opposite to military intelligence officer that exists, and she has been doing it for 12 years with evident satisfaction. Diane and I are identical twins. This is relevant. We have been identical for 34 years in the specific, uncanny way that identical twins are identical. The same face, the same height, the same voice in a register that even our mother occasionally confused when we were children. The differences are there, and they are significant, and the people who know us well see them immediately. The people who do not know us well do not always see them at all. I had a family emergency on a Wednesday. The specifics of the emergency are not the point of this story. What matters is that it was genuine, it was urgent, and it required me to be 4 hours away by 8 in the morning, which meant I could not be on base. I had tried the official channels. I had called my sergeant, I had called the duty officer, I had called everyone who could formally cover my responsibilities for a single Wednesday, and discovered through those calls that Wednesday was a day when the unit was already stretched, and covering me officially was going to create a cascade of problems that I did not want to create. I called Diane at 6 in the morning. I said, "I need a favor and I need you to say yes before I explain what it is." She said, "That's never a good sentence." I said, "Please." She said, "Tell me what it is." I told her. There was a pause. She said, "You want me to go to your military base and pretend to be you." I said, "Just for the day. It's a low-activity Wednesday. Nothing significant is scheduled. You would mostly just need to be present and sign some routine paperwork and not say anything unusual." She said, "Claire, I am a high school English teacher." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know anything about military protocol." I said, "I'll brief you on the morning. It's 4 hours. I'll tell you everything you need to know." She said, "What if someone asks me something I can't answer?" I said, "Diane, you're the most competent person I know. You manage 30 teenagers simultaneously for 7 hours a day. One military unit for 8 hours is nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do I wear?" I briefed her for 90 minutes before I left. I want to be honest about the briefing, because I want to be honest about my role in what followed. I told her the basic protocols. I told her who the key people were and how to address them. I told her what paperwork needed to be signed and where to find it. I told her that the most important thing was to be present and professional and to avoid any situation that required specialized knowledge. I said, "The one thing you need to avoid is Colonel Mercer." She said, "Who's Colonel Mercer?" I said, "My commanding officer. He's difficult." She said, "Difficult how?" I thought about how to describe Colonel Mercer in the 90 minutes I had available and the several years of experience I had with him. Colonel Mercer had been my commanding officer for 3 years. He was the kind of senior officer who had built his career on a specific, practiced management of the people below him, not through competence, which was adequate but not exceptional, but through the careful cultivation of loyalty upward and pressure downward. He had been respected by the people above him because he managed their perception of him effectively. He was difficult for the people below him because he managed them in a way that served his upward trajectory, rather than their development or the unit's actual effectiveness. He had been difficult for me specifically for reasons that I will not detail fully here, because some of them are still part of an institutional process. The short version, I had produced work that had attracted attention at levels above him, and he had managed that attention in the way he managed everything, to his benefit and to the minimum necessary acknowledgement of where the work had come from. I had been navigating this for 3 years, with the specific, patient, institutional navigation of someone who knows the game and plays it carefully because the career requires it. I said, "Just avoid him. If he asks for me, tell him I'm unavailable and you'll pass along the message." Diane said, "Avoid the difficult colonel." Got it. Then I left. I was 4 hours away when Diane texted me at 9:15 in the morning. The text said, "I accidentally went to the wrong briefing." I called her immediately. She said, "I followed the schedule you gave me, but there were 2 rooms with people going into them at the same time, and I went into the wrong one." I said, "Which briefing?" She named it. I said, "Diane, that's the command level briefing. I'm not even supposed to be in that briefing." She said, "Well, I'm in it now. Everyone nodded at me when I came in. I think they think I'm you." I said, "Get out. Politely say you received incorrect information about the room." She said, "I can't get out now, they've started. Also, Claire, your Colonel Mercer, is running this briefing." I said, "Diane." She said, "He just said something I think is wrong. Can I tell him?" I said, "Absolutely do not tell him." She said, "Why not? He's wrong." I said, "Because he is my commanding officer, and I have to work with him every day and—" The call dropped. I tried to call back 6 times in the next 20 minutes. Diane did not answer. This was, I would learn later, because she had put her phone on silent when she entered the briefing room and had forgotten to turn the sound back on, which is the kind of thing that a high school English teacher does automatically in a professional setting, and which is the kind of thing that is also extremely inconvenient when you are trying to reach her urgently. I drove 4 hours and managed a family emergency and did not hear from Diane again until 11:47, when she texted, "Briefing is over. I told him he was wrong. He was not happy. Also, I may have said some other things." I said, "What other things?" She said, "It came up that his analysis was based on outdated methodology, and I pointed out some issues. He asked where I was getting my information. I said, from years of watching you take credit for work you didn't do while treating the people who actually did it like they were invisible." I stared at my phone. I said, "Diane, you said that to my commanding officer in a command-level briefing?" She said, "He had it coming. Also, 2 of the other officers in the room said they had been waiting for someone to say it for a long time." I said, "What happened after?" She said, "He asked me to come to his office. Hold on, I'm going there now." I said, "Do not go to his office." She did not respond. I want to tell you about the 2 hours between 11:47 and 1:53, because they were the most agonizing 2 hours of my professional career, and I have had several years of genuinely agonizing professional moments to compare them to. I was 4 hours away dealing with a family emergency. My twin sister, who had never been in the military, who was wearing my uniform, who had attended a classified briefing she was not supposed to be in, had just told my commanding officer, in front of a room full of senior officers, that he had been taking credit for work he didn't do while treating the people who did it like they were invisible. This was true. Everything she said was true. It was also the kind of true that takes years to say in the right way, at the right moment, to the right people through the right institutional channels. Diane had said it in a briefing room in 9 minutes. I called my JAG officer. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring, and I told him what was happening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is your sister currently in Mercer's office?" I said, "I believe so." He said, "And she said all of that in the command briefing?" I said, "Yes." He said, "With senior officers present?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Claire, I need you to understand something." I said, "What?" He said, "This might be fine." I said, "How is this possibly fine?" He said, "Because there are witnesses, senior ones, and because if what she said is accurate, and based on what you've told me over the past year it is accurate, then what just happened in that room is not necessarily a problem for you." He said, "Stay by your phone." Diane texted me at 1:53. She said, "I think that went well." I said, "Tell me everything right now, everything." She said, "Okay, so I went to his office and he was very angry and he said a lot of things about insubordination and conduct unbecoming, and I let him finish, and then I said, and I'm quoting myself here because I want you to appreciate this, I said, 'Colonel, I've been teaching English for 12 years, and I know the difference between someone who is angry because they've been wronged and someone who is angry because they've been seen. You are angry because you've been seen. And the two people sitting in your outer office right now appeared to be from the Inspector General's office, which suggests that other people have noticed what I noticed." I stared at my phone. I said, "There were people from the Inspector General's office outside his office?" She said, "Yes. Apparently they had been scheduled to meet with him today about something unrelated to me, but when I walked in with all of my energy, the timing was quite something." I said, "Diane." She said, "He asked me to leave." I left. On the way out, one of the IG people asked if I had a moment to speak with them, and I said yes, and I told them what I had said in the briefing and what the basis for it was. I gave them your documentation, the file you keep on your laptop. I hope that's okay. I said, "You gave them my documentation file?" She said, "You showed it to me once. I remembered where it was. I thought it seemed relevant." I said, "Diane, that file took me 3 years to build." She said, "I know. It's very thorough." They seemed impressed. I drove back to the base at 4 in the afternoon. I want to be honest about what I felt during that 4-hour drive, because honesty is the whole point of this telling. I felt terror, the specific, cold terror of someone whose career has been managed by a situation they did not control and who does not yet know the outcome. I felt something else too, something I am less comfortable admitting, but which I will admit because it is true. Relief. The specific, exhausted relief of something that had been building for 3 years having finally broken the surface. Whatever the consequences, and I did not know the consequences yet, and the not knowing was its own weight, it was out. The thing that had been managed and documented and navigated with institutional patience for 3 years had been said out loud by someone who had no career to protect, and no institutional caution, and no reason to soften it. Diane had walked into a command briefing as a high school English teacher in my uniform and said what 3 years of careful, strategic patience had not yet produced the moment for. I arrived at the base at 4:30. At 5:15, my sergeant called me. He said, "Captain, Colonel Mercer submitted his resignation at 1700. I sat in my car in the parking area. I said, "He resigned?" My sergeant said, "Effective immediately. The IG meeting apparently accelerated some things that had been pending." I said, "I see." He said, "Captain, is there anything you want to tell me about today?" I said, "I'll be in your office at 0800 tomorrow morning." He said, "Yes, ma'am." I hung up. I called Diane. She answered on the first ring and said, "So, how was your day?" I want to tell you what happened when Diane and I sat at my kitchen table that evening, because it is the part of the story I have thought about most in the months since. She had taken off my uniform. She was back in her own clothes, jeans and a sweater, the clothes of a high school English teacher on a Wednesday evening. She had made tea, which she does in difficult moments, and there were 2 mugs on the table between us. I said, "You could have destroyed my career." She said, "I know." I said, "You went into a classified briefing you weren't supposed to be in." She said, "I know." I said, "You told my commanding officer in front of senior officers that he takes credit for work he didn't do." She said, "I know." I said, "You gave my confidential documentation file to the Inspector General's office." She said, "I know." I said, "Diane." She said, "Claire."
I said, "It was all true, everything you said." She said, "I know." I said, "How did you know what to say?" She looked at me. She said, "Because you've been telling me about this man for 3 years, every Sunday phone call, every time I asked how work was. 3 years of you describing in careful, managed language a situation that was unfair and that you were handling with patience because the career required it." She said, "I don't have a career to protect. I have 30 teenagers who I have to teach to say true things clearly. That's my whole job." She said, "I just did my job." I held my tea mug. I said, "The IG meeting was already scheduled. You didn't know that." She said, "No, that was luck." I said, "If the IG hadn't been there," she said, "it would have been a much more complicated story. But they were there, and I had the file." I said, "You remembered where the file was from one time I showed it to you." She said, "I have a very good memory. Also, it was labeled clearly. You're very organized." I looked at my sister across the kitchen table, this woman who was my face and my voice and my height, and who was in every other way entirely different from me, and who had walked into my workplace for one day with no fear and no caution and no institutional patience, and had done in 8 hours what I had been building toward for 3 years. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." She said, "Also, I think you should know that your sergeant is very kind. He figured out I wasn't you around 11 o'clock, but he didn't say anything." I said, "He figured out?" She said, "He said I hold my pen differently than you do. Apparently, you hold yours at a very specific angle." I said, "Sergeant Morrison knew all day." She said, "And covered for me. He's a good man."
The formal process that followed Colonel Mercer's resignation took 4 months. I will not describe it in full because it is institutional and ongoing in some of its dimensions. What I will tell you is what is true. Mercer resigned. The IG investigation that had been pending, I learned, for longer than I had known, on matters that were adjacent to but not identical to what Diane had described, was completed. My documentation, the 3 years of careful, methodical record, was reviewed by people whose review of it produced consequences that I am not at liberty to describe specifically, but that I will describe in the terms that Mercer had used years ago when referring to a colleague who had been similarly reviewed: career limiting. I was not disciplined for Diane's actions. This was the outcome I had feared most, and it did not occur, for reasons that Marcus Webb explained in the careful language of someone who had thought about it in advance and had prepared for the conversation. The primary reason: I had not asked Diane to do any of the things she did. I had asked her to sign routine paperwork and avoid Colonel Mercer. She had done neither of those things and had instead done everything else. The documentation she submitted to the IG had been my documentation, but submitting it was her decision, made without my instruction. The sergeant who had covered for her, Morrison, received a formal commendation for handling an unusual situation with professionalism and discretion. This was, as far as I know, the first military commendation ever awarded for knowing that the person holding a pen at the wrong angle was not the officer she claimed to be, and deciding that some things were more important than the discrepancy. I have a new commanding officer. She is, by every measure available to me after 8 months of working with her, the opposite of Colonel Mercer in all the ways that count. I called Diane on the day the new CO was announced. I said, "You're not allowed to impersonate me again." She said, "I know." I said, "Under any circumstances." She said, "Understood." She said, "Did I fix it, though?" I thought about that. I said, "Yeah, Diane, you fixed it." She said, "Good. My students have a test tomorrow. I have papers to grade." Then she hung up. I want to say something about having a twin. People ask what it is like to have another person in the world who is your face and your voice, and who has been, since before you can remember, the most familiar presence in your existence. It is not something that translates easily into description. It is simply a fact of your reality, the way certain things are facts, present, unremarkable in the daily sense, and then occasionally revealed to be extraordinary. Diane is not me. She is the same face and a completely different person, and she has been both of those things for 34 years. She does not have my caution. She does not have my institutional patience. She does not have 3 years of documentation and a carefully constructed strategy and the specific professional discipline of someone who has learned to work within a system that requires it. She has 30 teenagers and a red pen and the absolute certainty that true things should be said clearly. On a Wednesday in October, she wore my uniform and walked into my workplace and said the true things clearly in the rooms where they needed to be said. And she did it without fear, because the fear was never hers to have. That is what it is to have a twin. She is the person who does the thing you can't do. And you, I imagine, are the person who does the thing she can't do. We have not yet figured out what that second thing is, but I suspect we will. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. Sometimes rising is your twin sister in your uniform saying what you've been building the case for 3 years. Sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one who has nothing to lose, and sometimes the best thing that ever happened to your career is a high school English teacher who holds a pen at the wrong angle. Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment. Has someone ever done something for you that you couldn't do for yourself? Tell me. I read every single one.